Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, indeed the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today I want you all to become familiar with an amazing man. His name is Gino Bartali. He is called, among other things, the Lion of Tuscany. He was a two-time winner of the Tour de France, which is strange enough in itself. But his first win was in 1938, and his second win was in 1948. And that's just the beginning of the interesting things about him we'll learn of in this program today. We're going to be talking about a book about him. The book is called Road to Valor, a true story of World War II Italy, the Nazis, and the cyclists who inspired a nation. And one of the two authors, Aili McConnon, is with us this morning, and her brother Andres is sleeping, or something like that. I don't know. There are at least, it seems to me, three stories in the book, or three sections. One is we focus on the young boy and the boy and the man who loved cycling almost more than anything in the world. The second part has to do with exploits that he got involved in during World War II. And the final part has to do with his going back to win the Tour de France again after a 10-year absence. And it's an amazing story. You did a great job.
Thank you so much. Why
do you think he was so important in Italy? That's one of the things that comes across in the book, which is a little difficult for an American to grasp.
Gino Bartali became so widely popular in Italy because he became a star cyclist at a time when cycling was the most popular summer sport in Europe. So if you think about it, he was a little bit like a Ted Williams or a Joe DiMaggio in the United States. Every little boy wanted to play baseball in the United States, and in Italy, every young boy wanted a bicycle. And everyone from mothers and fathers and kind of schoolgirls and working people, everyone used bicycles to get everywhere. At this point, when he grew up, he was born in 1914, and up until close to the end of the 1940s, there were more bicycles in Italy than cars. And so everyone used bicycles to travel.
Sure. One of the other fascinating things about bicycling and Italy, and I guess in other countries over in Europe at that time, was that there were big races like the Tour de France, the Tour of Italy. What's the name of that one?
The Giro d'Italia, exactly.
But in addition to that, there were all kinds of smaller races from city to city and town to town. So I guess it really grew that way.
It did, and for many people who would grow up and had never left, the confines of their small village or town, if you became a cyclist, it gave you the chance to, travel and see the country in a way that was really unprecedented in that time.
What a way to get around.
Exactly.
In doing your research, and you did an awful lot of research for this book, one of the threads seems to be this notion of succeeding in cycling could help you to succeed in life. It could make you wealthy and do a lot of other things for you.
That's certainly very true in the case of the character we wrote about, Gino Bartali. His parents were from very humble background. They lived on the outskirts of Florence. His father was a day laborer and juggled actually several jobs. He worked at times kind of in the field. Sometimes he at night would extinguish street lamps, basically anything he could do to help earn money to feed his family of four. And even with all the work that he did, he basically earned the equivalent of about $1 an hour. And there are many, many people who are in this sort of barely kind of scraping by state, working very close to poverty. And so cycling suddenly offered, the opportunity to, escape this life. And for Bartali, that was when he started to get some early success. He started first in a local team, but then there were these races, as you mentioned, kind of in the region in Tuscany and then further afield in Italy, where you could actually, you would also have a team, that would pay for you, or that paid you a salary rather, and then there were purses from the races themselves, and suddenly he would be making, more than 10 times what his, father had made, and was able to, after actually his first big win, the 38 Tour, was able to purchase a new home for his parents.
Yes. And then beyond that, he bought some other properties, which he used to advantage in a later stage of his life.
That's correct, yes.
But like any other young man, he falls in love.
That's correct.
With a woman named of Adriana. And she was a little different from other girls of that time in that she worked, she drove, and she smoked. That's
right. And she, part of the reason I think that Adriana was appealing or caught, let's say, Gino's eye, was that she was quite modest. And, when the time that he first set eyes on her, he was already a cycling star, but she was really unfazed by his celebrity status.
Yeah, she was.
And he found that, kind of quite appealing, and sort of, and there's quite a sweet anecdote. I had the chance to interview her. She's still alive, and talking about him first courting her. And he was very bashful and very shy. This was a man who was, already fast becoming one of the most famous athletes in Italy. Mm-hmm. But he, struggled to get the words out to ask her to escort her home to the tram, was his first sort of question.
Not all the way home.
Not all the way home.
Just to the tram.
Exactly.
Well, all this wonderful stuff is playing out in the shadow of World War II. And then when World War II overtakes it, Gino has other things to worry about. We'll find out what they are when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Aili McConnon. That's our guest's name today, the name of her book, which she co-wrote with her brother Andres, Road to Valor. It's a true story of World War II Italy, the Nazis, and the cyclists who inspired a nation. Publisher is Crown Books. And Elie Wiesel, who very nice gentleman, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, among many other honors, says of this book, "Thou shalt not stand idly by," is a powerful biblical command. In Aili and Andres McConnon's book, it offers a moving example of moral courage. A simple citizen and a great athlete chose to oppose a cruel and racist political dictatorship by saving Jewish victims in Italy. Was it so hard to become a hero then? It was enough to remain human. And yet, he did some wonderful things. I know, we think of the persecution of Jews as something that happened horribly in Germany, which is true. But there was also stuff going on in Italy. There was a proclamation of scientists.
That's right.
Which said that the Jewish people aren't part of the human race.
That's correct. That was as early as 1938, and it sort of is the beginning of measures where Italian Jews had been integral and kind of in the fabric of Italian society.
Yes, yeah.
And as sort of these different measures that became laws that were sort of slowly separating Italian Jews from the rest of the society.
And once you do that, and you give them a status less than human, there isn't anything you can't do to them.
Exactly, and it started with forbidding young children from attending the same schools, Jewish Italian children from attending the same schools as Italians, and they got much worse, as the war progressed, and especially after the Nazis occupied Italy, then they were also sent off to concentration camps.
I think it was, I would say that it was through Cardinal Della Costas that this bike rider got involved with the Jewish question.
That's exactly right, and Cardinal Della Costa, who's the Cardinal of Florence at the time, was friends with Gino Bartali because they'd both been active in different Catholic groups, and Della Costa had married Bartali, he'd baptized his son, And in the fall of 1943, there were a lot of Jewish refugees in Florence. And at the same time, the Nazis had occupied Italy. And suddenly, these Jewish refugees were in dire need of both shelter, food, but most importantly, false identity documents that would show that instead of being Jewish Italian, which was a problem when you showed that at a military, any sort of check, they needed identity documents that would flag them as simply Italian. And so the cardinal had at his disposal various monasteries and convents, places that he sent notes saying and asking them to welcome Jewish refugees. But he had one critical problem. He needed to be able to transport these false identity documents to these various places. And so that's when Gino Bartali came into the picture, his old friend. He realized this was the one man who had a very good alibi and had been frequently training on the roads in Tuscany and Umbria, and was, a very recognizable face. He'd been on newspaper cover pages on magazines, so that he would be able to, and he was able to move through the countryside with an ease that most regular citizens were not at this time during the war.
Yeah, he rarely got stopped. And if he got stopped at all, it was very briefly. Oh, you know who I am. I'm the great bicyclist. And they, oh, yeah.
Okay. He'd offer an autograph and sort of, and the other thing was he didn't have any bags along, so that was, he didn't raise suspicion for bringing weapons like some of the, the other resistance fighters.
One of the fascinating details that you people discovered in your research is that the gentleman doing the forging was an atheist. Working with a Benedictine monk. Tell us about that guy and the connection.
Sure. The printer who made the counterfeited documents was actually a father-son combination of printers. Their name was the Brizzis, and they were based in Assisi. And they were fiercely patriotic to Italy, but they were atheists. They didn't have any sort of religious beliefs. But when they started seeing the persecution of Jews in Italy, a friend of the printers who happened to be a monk appealed to the printer, and said that, listen, these are people that have, contributed to Italian society. They have Italian pride just like you do. And now suddenly the country, has turned their back on them. And sort of in that way, and using that logic, he was able to recruit this printer to do the very critical work of creating these counterfeit identity documents.
And they did. They did a great job.
They did. They worked well, and the people were able to, either remain in hiding, or they also were able at that time to move further south. The Allies at this time had reached the bottom of Italy and were slowly moving their way up.
But Gino was doing more than that, than being a courier of documents. He was also hiding out a whole family.
That's correct. And in his youth, as a young boy, he'd had a Jewish Italian friend that he'd met through his cousin. So it was a friend that he had enjoyed a long friendship with. They'd kind of split, but then when the war came to Italy, this friend now was married, had 2 children, reached out and, had the critical problem that he needed to hide. And Gino, being a man who had a little bit more means as a cyclist, he'd had his own home, but he also had investments and owned other apartments, was able to find him first an apartment, and then second, when the situation became much worse in Italy, a basement for the family to hide in, and that's the way that they survived the war. And
the son of that family is still alive, and you interviewed him.
That's correct. His name was...
In Israel.
Exactly. His name was Giorgio, and it was probably one of the most amazing moments of the book in our research process, discovering this gentleman, because he had actually not spoken about this publicly until 2011. So Gino Bartali was dead by this point. But we found this gentleman and had the chance to sort of sit and meet with him. And when you really have the opportunity to hear someone's personal story, it brings the experience to life. It's one thing to say that, he saved, dozens or hundreds of people, but quite another to have the personal face on that tale.
Sitting right in front of you.
Exactly.
Talking. Well, up to this point, it's certainly been a wonderful, great life with much achievement, but it ain't the end. There's something still down the road, and we'll see what that is when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
And the book we read for this week's program is called Road to Valor, a true story of World War II Italy, the Nazis, and the cyclist who inspired a nation. with us talking about it is one of the authors, Aili McConnon. Her co-author, her brother, Andres McConnon, could not be with us. We're sorry about that, but she's doing a hell of a job without him. The book has received praise from all over. We talked about Elie Wiesel, and now I want to talk. We'll have somebody talk who's a professional tour cyclist, and that's another area. His name is Michael Barry, and he says in part, "This is the rigorously researched account of a true champion and role model, Gino Bartali, who became stronger when faced with extreme adversity. His bicycle became the tool with which he saved countless lives during World War II and inspired a broken nation. It is a profoundly uplifting story." I agree. Very, very uplifting. Now, he not only became stronger when faced with extreme adversity, he used to get angry. There are several places in the book where, while the race is going on, he pulls over to the side and punches a guy out for something he said or he thought he said or something he was holding up. And he had difficult relationships with many of his fellow cyclists, including, what's his name? I can't find it.
Fausto Coppi probably
Yes,
is.
that's the one. That's the one. I mean, he and those two should have been teammates, and they weren't because they couldn't get along.
That's right. They're both fiercely independent and both very competitive, which helped them in their sport, but that also meant that they, in the sport of cycling, teammates are not all equal, where you have a team, but there's very much a leader, and then the other cyclists they're called, in French, they call them domestiques or servants, and you kind of serve the leader, and you do everything from kind of riding ahead to sort of provide a windbreak, to bringing them water, to helping them even if they need to relieve themselves on the bicycle. So you need to have a certain humility to accept the role of the domestique, and I think in Bartali's rivalry with Fausto Coppi, they both had strong talent themselves, and neither wanted to function in that role.
And both of them had great success in Italy. They had their own fan base, and so it was difficult, but it was one that neither man could really work out.
Exactly, and Bartali had a reputation for having quite a tempestuous personality. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind. And so, he often did. And I think those sort of contradictions were what made him fascinating to us, that he could be both known as being incredibly devout. He was known as the pious one, but that he could also get into, screaming matches. He was both a great endurance athlete, but he also liked smoking and began smoking on the advice of his doctors, who saw his low heart rate and said, you know what, as an athlete, it helps for your heart to beat more quickly. It would be wise for you to smoke a few cigarettes before key stages.
Well, and he also drank the interview juice you were talking about, Chianti.
That's right. He really enjoyed his red wine. And in this era, many cyclists would enjoy wine, the night before, hours before a key stage in the Tour de France, hours before they would spend 10 hours on the bicycle, which, is, from a current perspective, hard to imagine.
Well, they also ate a lot more.
That's right. They'd have big steaks before, riding for at least 5 or 6 hours.
Talk about carving up.
Yes.
Oh, my. Well, at some point, he makes a decision to, once again, 10 years after his first triumph, to try to win the Tour de France. Why, in terms of your research, do you think he wanted to do that?
Bartali returned to cycling and wanted to return to his former glory. He'd won the Tour in 1938 because cycling was what he knew best, and in many ways what the only thing he could do. He wasn't trained in any other profession. And as Italy was rebuilding after World War II, he realized that his future career had to be in cycling. Mm-hmm. And so the Tour de France was the most sort of prestigious world cycling event. And so he realized that if he wanted to make his mark again in the sport, he had to try to recapture that title.
It's interesting to think about the main reason, in my opinion, that he was tied into that situation, that his only way forward was cycling. It was very simple. He was a peasant.
Exactly.
And he had no trade.
That's right.
And so at a time when wiser heads would say, which they said, you're over the hill. You're too old. He said, I'm going to try.
Exactly, and the journalists had a good nickname for him, Il Vecchio, the old man.
The old man, yeah.
And when he started the 48 Tour de France, he very quickly, people started writing him off. He didn't perform very well in the first half of the race. The Italian journalists had, dismissed his chances. His teammates began to wonder. Even his coach began to doubt him, saying that, he was a good cyclist, but, he wasn't young enough to sort of withstand the multiple days of strain.
Multiple days, and also the terrain.
The terrain, exactly.
I mean, there are a couple of illustrations in the book which graphically suggest what terrain we're talking about.
And some of the mountains are so steep that, bicyclists had to get off of their bicycles and push them up, especially when you factored in the weather, which during the 1948 Tour was very unpredictable. It could be very hot at one point. They had snow and sleet up in the Alps.
Hold on. They had snow and sleet in the course of the Tour de France.
Exactly, in the middle of July. Partly is due to the fact they're quite high, but this was still very unusual weather.
Well, it's always the same height, but I've never heard of snow, at the Tour de France. But it happened.
Made cycling more interesting.
One of the things that happens is that the tour director, after this particular Tour de France was over, said this: "From snowstorms, water, and ice, Bartali rose like a mud-covered angel, wearing under his soaked tunic the precious soul of an exceptional champion." We'll let them wonder whether he won that, because they should go out and get Road to Valor, true story of World War II, Italy, the Nazis, and the cyclist who inspired a nation. We've been talking to Aili McConnon, who is one of the co-authors. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.